Hello everyone, my name is Jay from Jade Productions. Welcome back to our next video in the Robotech Game Guide series. This video will be covering combat basics and is designed for both GMs and players. In this video, we are now going to be going through the essential nuggets that a player and GM both need to know for how to run combat. Now, in our previous video, we talked about the skill system and skill challenges. This will be relevant to this video, as the entirety of the system still revolves around that essential structure. That essential structure involves picking your two skills, as is the case with our character that we have previously generated, Locke, and with that, picking 1 to 2 skills, and then rolling the combined value of those skills as d6. In the same way that we would deal with a static challenge, we do the same with combat. Now, allow me to elaborate further on this, but first, we need to cover the game rounds. Now, when you enter into a conflict, which is the terminology for combat, essentially, you then proceed to go through a round system, which is detailed, or at least briefly given here at the bottom of your character sheet for quick reference, so you can understand this. Now, there is no initiative in Robotech. Instead, the game, each round, begins with a communications phase. In this communications phase, which should technically follow a description of the conflict. For example, here in the conflict that we are going to use to demonstrate combat basics today, a Super VF-1 has flown in and encountered a rogue battle pod. This conflict is happening in amongst perhaps a massive battle, or perhaps this is a rogue Zentradi that has been encountered on patrol. Either way, Locke in this VF-1, I know for people who are very picky about the lore, but it doesn't matter. He's just a character sheet we created, and these are just the first 2 tokens I picked out to make things very simple, because they are very much the 2 most basic mecha in the game, and are perfect for our purposes today. Now, he's encountered this Zentradi. That is the description overview. That is the conflict. Very simple. You can get more elaborate, you can get less elaborate. You can have a multitude of things going on, but so long as you define what is actually part of the conflict. For example, there could be numerous battle pods here in the background. There could be additional allies, there could be other fights going on, there could be all sorts of things. But during the description, the GM needs to lay out the elements that surround the conflict and are within the conflict, and should make sure that they note things that they're intending to be in the conflict, at least to themselves. As it's a role-playing game, it's not as if you're suddenly locked into this conflict and you can only fight things in conflict. Everything around it will form a greater picture of the narrative unfolding, as a player might sweep out here and try and engage the other battle pods. The player, for example, as Locke, might attempt to use the buildings and surroundings as cover, so on and so forth. So it is very important that you lay out the general area of your conflict, either through maps or through a description for theater of mind. Next, we go into a communications phase. Now, communications phase is essentially a small phase which is timed by the GM. Now, GM, there's no set time limit for you to impose. You must decide it yourself. For example, I normally give players 2 minutes, but sometimes I'll give them no communications phase, sometimes I'll give them very long communications phases. This is often the best way to decide this, is typically what kind of fictional situation are they in? What is the time pressure here? What is the stress? The communications phase represents both in and out of character communications. Now, obviously, since you're role-playing, the preference is to use in-character communications, and this is what this phase serves to do. For example, looking at the example given in the actual book, the players discuss their plan. The ace pilot says he wants to thin out the swarm of battle pods before they can engage the cat's eye they're escorting. The wingmate wants to defend a cat's eye, and the officer says he wants to get more intelligence about the area. This is the players telling both the GM and each other what their intentions are. Now, by technicality, they are not actually bound by what they say in the communications phase. A player reserves the right to change their mind as the situation in the fiction develops, based on the appropriate roles that follow in the following phases. Bear this in mind. You are not locked in. You may discuss a plan. Your GM may give you some feedback on that plan when discussing it out of character. In character, you may be able to do it. But that is essentially the point. You are not locked in, but you can give it time to formulate this plan. The GM must then also use what you're indicating to figure out the narrative description for how this is happening. And we'll get more on this in a moment. As combat is simultaneous, there is no initiative, which means you need to be very careful with your action management in the action economy of Robotech. So, one final thing about the communications phase is that the players must actually be able to communicate in order to be able to take advantage of it. Thus, players who are getting their radios jammed, players who are out of comms, players who aren't nearby or in radio range, players who have gagged in character, all this, they cannot communicate in the communications phase. So keep that in mind when applying your fiction, because the communications phase is a very powerful tool for the players, but they will not always have access to it, and depriving it from them through the use of fictional circumstances is incredibly powerful and can create far more dramatic moments, especially when, example, two players might be able to communicate, but one player cannot. So, bear this in mind. The next step, after the communications phase, is getting the drop. Getting the drop is essentially the part where, for example, in Dungeons & Dragons, you would determine if anyone gets a sneak attack or bonus round. Enemies or players can get the drop. Now, getting the drop should be determined based on your fictional circumstances. Do you have superior positioning? Do the enemy know you're there? Have you used stealth mecha? So on and so forth. Whatever circumstances might allow the players to get the drop on an enemy, or an enemy to get the drop on the players, vice versa, should be considered when deciding if anyone in the conflict has got the drop in that round. Combatant within the conflict who has got the drop is able to conduct all of their actions and phases first before anyone else. So, for example, let's say that Locke here in the VF1 has got the drop on this Zentradi battle pod, having not noticed it. This means Locke will then get to go through his support phase, ops phase, and interact phase, and make his actions within those before the Zentradi battle pod in the same conflict gets to make his actions in the appropriate phases. Support, ops, interact, or cinematic phase. Next, we come to the actual action phases. The action phases are divided into 3 different broad categories, and these are resolved mechanically one at a time, though bear in mind the conflict and all the action is happening simultaneously. This is to proceduralize things so that you can work through it, take an accounting at the end as the GM, and then give an appropriate description and apply all of the events as they've gone. So, first is the support phase. The support phase is where 3 different actions may be taken. This is the observe action, obscure action, and the assist action. Further, the observe action is broken down into 2 sub-actions, essentially, which players can choose from. Now, players are still using 1 to 2 skills, as described. For example, Locke could choose to use one of his skills with, for example, cover your buddy in the support phase in order to assist an ally, to make an assist action. Then, he could choose to use close quarters in the ops phase to attack. Thus, you'll need to manage your actions very carefully, since you only ever get 2, plus any equipment suite, plus any other bonus actions. We will cover more on equipment suites and bonus actions later. The actions themselves break down as such. Observe actions are your classic perception. You are attempting to observe either an area or an individual to identify things about it. There are 2 kinds of observe, which are targeted and area observes. These, when a player attempts to do one of these, or any combatant, you should always make sure that they designate, are they attempting to do a targeted or an area. Observe has many different effects in the combat, which can be used to a multitude of advantages. For example, Observe might be used to discover hidden units. It might be used to identify a villain hiding amongst smaller groups of enemies, to find a weak point in enemy armor, for example, to calculate the total number of enemy units on the field, to tell more information about specific kinds of enemies, maybe variants and equipment that they're actually got. It could be used to try and interpret the enemy's intent and their actions and their strategy, or otherwise find something that is out of place. Observe is both generic, but also very powerful. Taking advantage of it as both the GM and the player is essential at the beginning of conflicts. A targeted observe is one of the subtypes of the observe action. Targeted observes focus on a single point in the environment. When you perform this, you choose your skill and roll any equipment suites, and you tally your successes as normal from your results. This allows you to learn specific stuff about one thing, one object, for example. So, to further illustrate, you would use a targeted observe to try and identify, for example, information about this battle pod. And we might use on lock the man-at-arms skill. So, our man-at-arms is 3, so we'll use 3 dice. We rolled out 3d6, and we rolled really, really well. Locke has managed to achieve 5 successes, with 2 6s and a 5. Going back down and looking at this so you understand, technically we're rolling at edge. Since we're a lone wolf, that is correct. We are in our element. So, 4s count as 1 success as well. Fortunately, we only rolled a 5, which counts as 1 success, and 2 6s, which count as 2 successes. Hence, our total score of 5 successes. With 5 successes, the GM might then rule that we learn the following about the battle pod. The GM might then decide there is a weak point in the engine system, which might indicate to us that perhaps from the GM side, this thing is not operating at full capacity. It may have worse systems. It might have existing battle damage. Its armor might be reduced, for example, statistically. And the GM might indicate this to us by telling us that the battle pod is actually in rather terrible shape. Its armor has been shredded and is pocked with holes. And the GM will give us as much information as he deems we deserve from those 5 successes, which is a pretty good amount of information to achieve. An area observe, on the other hand, would attempt to learn more about everything around us, and is trying to scan across the entire environment. When performing an area observe, after you roll your successes, you halve the number of successes you have, since you are trying to focus across a much broader spectrum of the environment rather than one object. In this case, our 5 successes gets halved and rounds down to 2 successes. Thus, we might learn with only 2 successes that maybe there's not much else out there in the environment. Or perhaps 2 successes is enough to illuminate that there is actually a second Zentradi battle pod, which is actually potentially fully armored, with stealth armor, hiding off in the distance, ready to pounce, and this first one is a diversion. But that is essentially how the observes boil down. You may do a focused observe, in which you get to keep all your successes, or a general area observe, in which you halve the number of successes. The next action is the obscure action. Obscure is the act of hiding yourself or others. Through the obscure action, you are performing essentially a combative or static challenge, as described in our previous video. You use your skill and however your fiction works to try and hide yourself. Doing so, your successes now become what is required as the difficulty number for enemies to observe you and target you. While an enemy has not beaten your difficulty number set by the number of successes you got on your obscure action, you cannot be seen nor targeted specifically, though you may still be hit by area of effect or other such fictional attacks, for example. This is how you perform stealth within the system, by the use of these obscure actions. Obscure is perhaps one of the most powerful, but also one of the most difficult to pull off. It's not just enough to say that you will obscure yourself, you do need to have the fiction within your skills to back up your action. If, for example, we are here in the middle of a desert, and this is an open field between us and the battle pod, an obscure action fictionally makes no sense. Thus, if we are really determined to do it, the GM might decide that that is an automatic failure, because there is nowhere fictionally that we can hide. However, we could try and justify to the GM that we would like to do an obscure in which we attempt to hide underneath and between the legs of this battle pod within its blind spot. The GM may apply some penalties, such as hindrance, but they will allow that roll. That is a fiction backing up our action. So, we make our roll, and we determine what kind of successes we get to actually obscuring. Let's just assume that we get the same roll again and have 5 successes. Well, that would mean that battle pod now needs to achieve 5 successes on its own observation action in order to actually find us so that it can target us. However, if an enemy just lobs a missile at the battle pod and us while we happen to be standing there, well, we're going to get hit. Not to mention, as obscures are based in fiction, my fiction there would not work if there was another enemy nearby. It would prevent the battle pod whose blind spot we're hiding in from targeting me, but not another battle pod which has a clear line of sight that might happen to be here, for example. Next, we have the assist action. Assist represents the act of actively engaging to help another party within the conflict. You might use it to work with your allies to coordinate against an enemy. You might use it to place, and fictionally, you might use it to lay down suppressive power. You might use it to help an ally find a power relay in repairing their mecha while they work somewhere else down below on the mecha in the midst of this combat. There are many applications for assist. The GM should be really strict on what counts as an assist and what counts as another action. If players just want to say they want to gang up on an enemy, and they're going to attack it, and an ally's going to attack it, but they want to use it as an assist action, the GM should make a clear, hard line that that is not an assist action, that is an attack action. The example used within the book to help you with what classifies as an assist, you take the time to analyze the enemy mecha. You see there is a small fracture that protects the power core. You relay this information to your friend who has a clean shot on that part of the mecha. You roll 4 successes to assist, and they roll 3 successes to attack later in the round. The total number of successes thus scored is 7. So, it allows you to spot and support indirectly without taking physical action. The 2 subtypes of the assist action are general and specific assists. Specific assists are directed to helping one specific ally with an action. Thus, you do your standard roll, you get your successes tallied, and you then apply those successes to your ally. Your ally will retain those successes and may use them later during this round, or now during this round, any point during the round, as automatic successes they have scored, and may put those towards an action that supports the fiction that you guys are working towards. For example, using the previous example that I read out about analyzing weaknesses in the battle pod, and then having an ally follow up with a shot, if you assisted them with a specific assist, and then scored your 3 successes, those 3 automatic successes go to your partner. However, if your partner, holding on to those 3 automatic successes, decides he wants to put one, for example, into observe or obscure, well, that's not really supporting the fiction that you've both already established. But he can put all 3 of those perhaps towards his attack. He might choose to put one towards defense, since you guys have identified this thing and you are trying to take it down safely. Next, there is the general assist. The general assist is a much more global, broad assist, designed to help a group of people. However, helping a group of people comes with its own downside. When helping a group of people, the successes that you get are actually placed into a global pool in the center of the table, or wherever fictionally. Like, if you're playing on Roll20, just make sure you have a note that there is however many assist dice in the pool. Each player in the conflict can take one automatic success from one of those assist dice in the pool. So, for example, if we get our 5 assists here, we're again just using the same roll as we've previously rolled for Locke. 5 dice go into the pool. If we have 2 allies, they can both take one of those dice, leaving 3 in the pool in total. The dice they take out count as automatic successes they can put towards any action. Each player can only take 1 dice from the global pool for 1 automatic success. The Ops phase is your primary action phase. The Ops phase is also the phase in which movement takes place. Movement does not cost an action. Movement is merely a free thing that you may do during the Ops phase. Typically, in Robotech, things move so fast that tracking movement is only really important for the fiction and theater of mind. However, when using larger maps and the grid-based movement and the movement characteristics of various mecha, keep this in mind, that this is the phase in which you may conduct your move. We will cover more on movement later. The Ops phase is divided into attack, defend, and redirect actions. These actions are fairly obvious in their intent, except for the redirect. Redirect is an interesting, if very open action, which gives a lot of tactical opportunity. First, let's dive into the attack action. The attack action is relatively simple, in that you will use your dice to attempt to attack an enemy and inflict damage upon them. Let us use one of our skills, perhaps Alpha Strike, for 3 dice. With this, we have only scored 1 success on a 4, thankfully, because we're in our element from being at edge, because we are alone in this conflict against this battle pod. With 1 success into attack, we put that towards our target. We've decided that this battle pod will serve as our target. If, for example, there were multiple battle pods, we would have to assign our attacks between them. We could declare that we might want to just target 1, and if we got, for example, 2 successes, we might put both successes into this 1 battle pod. If there were 2 battle pods here, we might put 1 success between them. When assigning your attack successes, it is very important to tell the GM who your intended target is that the attack successes are being assigned against. Defend successes directly counter attack successes. When you make a defense, for example, this battle pod might make a defense roll to attempt to dodge our attack, and it gets 2 successes. For each success you get to defend, you directly negate 1 attack success against you. It is a 1-for-1 negation on attack versus defense. This is very important for when operating lighter mecha, which will be talked about in a later video dedicated to light combat, as well as videos dedicated to mecha combat and naval combat, on-foot combat, and further additional combat types. The redirect action is a very open action. Redirects represent moves that are non-damaging attacks. For example, they may be trips, grapples, or attempts to disarm a target. In the case of performing a redirect, you would describe what you are attempting to achieve, and the GM would then set a difficulty number and treat it as a skill challenge which you must succeed at. For example, if I wanted, with Locke here, to attempt to trip the battle pod, the GM might decide and set a difficulty number of 2. The skill I use must now get more than 2 successes in order to achieve this redirect. So, if we take this roll here, where I've only scored 1, and the GM has set a difficulty of 2, I would fail to successfully redirect the battle pod, and therefore would not trip it. If, for example, we use the previous roll, where Locke achieved 5 successes, this would beat the difficulty number threshold set by the GM in order to successfully trip the battle pod, and thus the battle pod would be tripped. The GM might declare that it is prone and knocked down. There might be other side effects to this as well. Redirects are very powerful tools and can be used in a vast variety of ways. Several examples of redirects, as stated, would include tripping, grappling, and disarming. Other kinds of redirects might involve repositioning an enemy into a different area, for example, using gunfire to ensure that they are moved into position where your ally might get them in a line of fire as part of an area of effect damage. Another really useful application of redirect might be causing enemy units in a close encounter to actually fire upon their own allies. These are possible applications for the redirect. The redirect is very open, leaving you lots of room to be creative in how you combat targets. The primary thing to consider when what is a redirect versus an attack is that redirects are not inflicting physical harm or damage onto the enemy yourself as a direct application of your weapons. The last phase is the cinematic phase, which is entered into after all of the relevant actions that are taking place between the parties within the conflict in the ops phase are done. Once the ops phase is resolved, we enter the cinematic phase. The cinematic phase features two actions: the inhibit/hindrance and the interact. The inhibit action is one that is used to stop an enemy from physically doing something. Inhibiting creates an obstacle for an enemy to overcome. By inhibiting, you subtract an enemy's successes for each success you achieve. This might be used to block them from hacking systems, or block them from attempting to open a door, or barging their way through an area. It is a physical obstacle you are imposing on an enemy to hinder them. This is directly countered by interact, which is the action used for interacting with the world and environment in any way not covered by any of the other actions. This can include opening doors, interacting with buildings, smashing your way through them to rescue stuff, hacking stuff, anything like so. This could be rescuing people. This could be attempting to try and persuade them or talk to them or talk them down. The interact may be used for a vast majority of non-combat purposes. After the cinematic phase is completed, the round ends. After that, the process begins again, returning back to the communications phase and the beginning of a new round. The new round then follows the same structure, going through the support phase, ops phase, and cinematic phase in repeat. This is the basic structure of a conflict within Robotech. The rounds will repeat until the conflict ends. In Robotech, conflicts are generally expected to go for 3 to 5 rounds at maximum. Most conflicts should resolve after 3 rounds, where an obvious outcome is decided. If, for example, a conflict is still ongoing and no one is perhaps dead, say in this specific conflict here, the GM might declare that the conflict is over, as this battle pod, perhaps heavily damaged from attack but still functional, decides to retreat. Conflicts should be kept short, snappy, and dramatic. Occasionally, you may need to go into longer conflicts. This is perfectly acceptable so long as you are aware of the pacing of your own game. Earlier, we talked about getting the drop, and how this involved a party within the conflict going first before everyone else, resolving all of their actions and all of their phases before anyone else in the conflict. Slowed is the reverse of this. Slowed are targets and parties within the conflict who resolve all of their actions through all of the phases after everyone else. Being slowed is a tremendous, tremendous penalty, as you can't act when everyone else is acting. Since combat is simultaneously, and all the actions are, by technically, happening at the same time. If, for example, the VF-1, piloted by Locke, attacks this battle pod, which is slowed, perhaps because of some other mitigating circumstances, the battle pod cannot act in the same ops phase as the VF1 to properly defend. Its ops phase has to happen later, after everyone else in this conflict has gone. Therefore, it cannot defend, leaving it quite vulnerable. After, for example, with 2 more players here, everyone has completed their actions, and we've ended the cinematic phase. This battle pod, which was slowed, then conducts its support phase, ops phase, and cinematic phase. Being slowed is the direct opposite of getting the drop. The final element to talk about in this video, in regards to combat basics, is the use of actions and synergies. Now, as previously explained, a player may use, or any party, for example, in case of major, minor villains, and lieutenants, may use 1 to 2 actions across their round, plus any equipment suites or bonus actions. Each action must be supported by a skill. So, going back to our example earlier, Locke used his Man-at-Arms in the support phase of that first round. He then used a second action, the close Alpha Strike, in the ops phase. And those were his 2 actions. That's it. Locke could then, in addition to this, use an equipment suite for a bonus action. He could use, for example, the GU-11's Heavy Burst equipment suite, which would be a separate action. Now, equipment suites are special in that they may be added on to other actions. For example, he might decide that he doesn't want to use the Heavy Burst in any other capacity, for example like redirecting. Instead, he would rather contribute it towards his attack. Thus, the equipment suite dice, which is 2 dice, would be added on to the dice we rolled from Alpha Strike for the attack. It is important to note that equipment suite dice do not count towards burnout, which is something that will be covered in a dedicated fatigue and burnout and stress video. The next important thing to note is synergy. A synergy occurs when you decide to use 2 of your actions, 2 of your skills, in the same phase. So, for example, you decide that, as Locke, you wish to use close quarters and ambush tactics for 4 dice inside the ops phase. You intended to use close quarters for defend, and you intended to use ambush tactics for attack. This is what you've conveyed to the GM. This, then, is a synergy, since you are doing both of your core actions inside of one phase. When performing a synergy, any of the successes you score from your dice rolled, which are rolled all at once instead of separately, may be assigned to any of the actions within that phase. So, since we're doing this synergy, and we're using ambush tactics and close quarters, each of those is worth 2 dice. To save us on time, the synergy has us roll those all together as just 4 dice, since they both contribute 2 each. This has scored us 3 successes. We may distribute these 3 successes as we wish between attack, defend, or redirect as part of the synergy. You may take synergies in any of the phases in which you happen to use 2 of your 2 core actions. You could perform a synergy in the support phase by wanting to do an assist and observe. Thus, the 3 dice that we've gotten, the 3 successes, could be applied to assist, observe, and obscure, putting 1 into each, if you so wished. The synergy allows you to do things like attack and defend at the same time, or assist and observe at the same time, or both interact and inhibit. There will be circumstances, both as players and as GMs, in which you wish to do synergies, and circumstances in which you wish to divide up your actions between the phases. This forms part of the action economy, in which you must carefully manage your action usage. Remember, if you do not defend, you don't defend against enemy attacks. So doing a synergy in the ops phase allows you to both attack and defend at the same time, keeping yourself both safe and letting you still deal damage. If you don't defend, and, like Locke here, broke up your actions between the initial observe and then an attack, you have no defend successes to negate the battle pod's own counterattack, which is happening at the same time. Thus, the battle pod's successes become damage. It will go into damage mitigation, and then we will proceed to damage resolution. We will elaborate more on the different kinds of damage and combat at the various scales in our following videos. Thank you for listening. I've been Jay from Jade Productions. I look forward to you joining us next time as we dive further into the Robotech series and the Robotech RPG by Strange Machine Games. Have a good day. I will see you next time.